In this video, I will go over the steps I took to line this cargo van with plywood using templates. Sadly, this isn't my van, so I only get to have it for a day. I started off by using construction paper to create my first template. I'm cutting it to the length of the cargo area and taking some measurements. I can then roughly mark out the shape and location of the wheel well, along with all the other contours of the van. I only need to do this to one side of the van as the other side is identical. I then rolled up the paper to bring it inside the workshop where I could cut it out properly. After a few tries, I managed to get the template pretty accurate. This is actually my second template as some of my measurements were a bit off the first time. Now that I have an accurate template to work from, I can then transfer that shape onto something more rigid and easier to work off. I'm using a 3mm MDF cover sheet that comes with the plywood when it gets delivered. I rolled out the paper template onto the MDF and carefully marked out my lines, making sure I had it lined up to the edges of the MDF and laid out flat against it. Once that's done, I can set aside the first template and start cutting out the MDF with a jigsaw. I used a scrap piece to prop up the MDF to give the jigsaw blade enough clearance underneath. I then sanded it smooth to refine the cuts and bring it to the line. Now that I have a new template, I can then use that to repeat the same process on the actual material. The material I'm using is called Transtex Ply from Plytech, which is birch plywood with a rugged and durable laminate designed for this sort of application. I had to get an oversized sheet to fit the van. The cover sheet in front of it is the size of standard plywood. It was very awkward to work with because of how big it was. Luckily this is only 12mm plywood. I had to get a bit of help moving this so I could cut it down in the driveway for it to fit in the workshop where I could work on it. It was a bit stressful and wet, so I didn't bother recording that part. After tracing the outline of the template and scoring it with a knife, I used the jigsaw and track saw to roughly cut it to shape. Then I could clean it up with a router using a flush cut bit, followed by a slight chamfer along all the sides to take the edges off. There are some anchor points in the van base that needed to be accessed through the plywood, so I had those locations carefully marked out and cut out a scrap piece to the size of the hole I wanted, and used CA glue to quickly glue down some strips around that piece to give me a guide for the router. I drilled holes to allow for the jigsaw blade and roughly cut out the shape. I then used the router again to clean up those cuts and give me a nice clean outline. Now I have one half of the platform ready to go. I can then repeat the exact same process to give me the other half of the platform. The cargo bay gets a quick sweep before putting in the plywood. I was pretty confident that everything would line up because I was working off a template which I made sure was a good fit. I kept one half of the plywood oversized so that when I put in the other half, I can lay it down on top and mark where they overlap. I can then trim it down to give it a perfect fit. After cutting it down with the track saw, I gave that freshly cut edge a chamfer on both sides and put it back in the van, and now the two halves come together really nicely. The fit turned out perfect, and the cuts around the edges were very clean. Also, the cutouts for the anchor points looked very tidy. After a quick cleanup, the van is now ready, and sadly I have to say goodbye to this awesome van. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I have a new website thanks to this clever tool, which has a ton of great templates to help get you started. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. It also automatically scales your website to keep it looking clean and professional across all devices. Get 10% off your first website by visiting squarespace.com/theoffcut.